Good evening. I'm delighted to see all of you here. I'm Gloria Groom, the chair and the David and Mary Winton Green Curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture. I'm so happy to welcome you to this first program for the exhibition that's opening tomorrow, but you can see it tonight, Among Friends and Rivals, Caravaggio in Rome. And as we begin, a brief reminder to please silence your phones. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the star of tonight's program and exhibition, Rebecca Long, recently promoted from Associate Curator to Full Curator. So now she is the Patrick G. and Shirley W. Ryan Curator in the department. An internationally known specialist in 17th century Spanish and Italian art, Rebecca came to the Art Institute in 2015, where she oversees all Spanish and Italian art before 1750. Her educational and professional career began with graduate studies at the New York University's Institute of Fine Arts, with a focus on the role of Italian artists in the Spanish court during the Renaissance. Since then, she's held many prestigious fellowships at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Indianapolis Museum of Art, the NYU's Villa La Pietra, and Harvard University's Villa I Tatti in Florence. She's also taught art history as an adjunct professor at Hunter College and the Fashion Institute of Technology, both in New York, Indiana Purdue University, University of Louisville, and more recently, Northwestern University. Before joining the Art Institute, Rebecca was associate curator at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. Her arrival in Chicago in 2015 coincided with an ambitious undertaking, the conception and realization of the Deering Family Galleries of Medieval and Renaissance Art, Arms, and Armor. And as you know, that's a really successful project. We love it, with the jousting horses and everything. And this she took on with curators Martha Wolf and Jonathan Tavares. Most recently, Rebecca was the originating curator of the exhibition El Greco, Ambition and Desire. Co-organized with the Musée du Louvre, it opened here a week before Chicago shut down in March 2020. And perhaps a few of you were fortunate enough to catch it before it shut down or when it reopened briefly in the fall. And for those of you who missed it completely, I recommend getting a copy or seeing a copy of the award-winning catalog, which Rebecca edited and co-authored. Her future projects include a retrospective exhibition on the 17th century Spanish artist from Sevilla, Francisco de Zurbarán, which she's organizing with the National Gallery in London and again, the Musée du Louvre. But tonight, we're celebrating Rebecca's recent achievement as curator of the exhibition Among Friends and Rivals, Caravaggio in Rome. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before I start, and I'll emphasize this again at the end, I want to encourage you, the show, mini show, we'll call it, upstairs, opens officially tomorrow, but since it's a Thursday evening and we're open late, if you would like to duck upstairs after tonight's presentation, you are welcome to see the exhibition in Gallery 211. The name of Caravaggio has been associated with a bold and revolutionary naturalism. To his contemporaries, his art, rooted in the senses, dependent on the live model, had an incredible power and artistic influence. He began his career as a painter of lyrical scenes of tavern and street life, including scenes of card players, musicians, and fortune tellers. He ended up developing into the most powerful religious artist of his age. In his lifetime, he was the most famous artist active in Italy, and his influence spread throughout the entire continent of Europe. He was, however, a difficult and violent personality, which is perhaps some of what makes him entertaining or attractive to a modern audience. We have an insight into a historical figure who really seems to have a personality that passes down to us through the ages. He, in his lifetime, flaunted his originality, but he also hated to be imitated. He mocked authority, yet he attempted to glom on to the social prestige of noble patrons and church patrons at the same time. His greatest gift, perhaps, in all of these genres of paintings, whether genre scenes or religious scenes, was a gift for empathy. Making religious narratives in particular for a modern audience, even if you are not bought into the kind of history of Catholic iconography, they seem contemporary, they seem new, and they seem vivid. I'm showing you here one of the few actual portraits of Caravaggio from his lifetime, although we'll see some examples of self-portraits that are embedded into his paintings by someone who knew him in his lifetime, although this was done, a drawing that was done after his life. I'm going to read you a description from a contemporary of what his appearance was, sort of couched in what we're meant to take away from that in terms of social distinction. He was a large young man, around 20 or 25 years when I saw him, with a thin black beard, black eyes with bushy eyebrows, dressed in black. He could have been a curator. In a state of disarray, with threadbare black hose and a mass of long black hair long over his forehead. And we see this commented upon by other people in his lifetime, the idea that he would buy really expensive clothes, velvet. Black was the most expensive fabric in the time after the Spanish fashion, and then wear them to being threadbare, which is maybe I'm reading too much into it, but an allusion to the type of artwork that he ended up producing. Caravaggio was born in Milan. We only know this in the last few years. His baptismal certificate in a parish church in Milan was discovered. His name is Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. So general understanding is that he comes from the town of Caravaggio, but he actually was born in Milan, and it seems like his family moved to Caravaggio, which is a small town nearby. In 1576, there was a plague, and they moved out of the big city. We understand this now in contemporary society. They moved out of the big city to the small town of Caravaggio. They had an intimate relationship with the noble family of the Sforza, and married into the Sforza, the Colonna family. His father worked as sort of like a major domo or kind of a site architect for the Sforza Colonna. And that kind of patronage, those noble personal connections will come back to him over time, over the course of his career. He apprentices to an artist that no one knows, basically, in Milan in 1584. It was a 4-year apprenticeship, so he was an adolescent. This is the tradition of the time. The artist's name was Simone Petrozzano, and he styled himself as a follower of Titian. Like maybe he met Titian in Venice, but he certainly is not a follower of Titian. But anyway, he was kind of one of the established figures in the art scene in Milan. And Caravaggio starts off there and does, we think, his full apprenticeship. No work survives before he lands in Rome in 1592. And we have an account from one of his biographers writing in 1672, so quite a bit later, but he claims that around the year 1590, Caravaggio was well known already in Milan for brawling with gangs of young men, and that he had committed a murder, which forced him to flee from Milan, first to Venice and then to Rome. That's a little bit spurious in the details, but based on other sources, we do think there was some sort of violent incident, maybe not a murder, but that he left Milan, and at some point in that year or two, in 1591, 92, he lands in Rome. And when he lands in Rome, he is a journeyman artist. He doesn't have patronage. He doesn't even have really a connection to any of the major studios. He sort of tries to get in with some of those established artists and their studios, which is how you make your way in a grand artistic market like Rome was at the time. It is the center of patronage in Italy. Because of the presence of the Catholic Church and because of the papacy and then all of the familial and cultural hangers-on to the papacy. So this is the orbit that Caravaggio would like to get into, but you need an introduction. And so he starts off painting works that, and I should say, starting out, none, maybe one, maybe two, one or two works are actually signed. And we're depending on archival documents and stylistic analysis in order to attribute these paintings to Caravaggio. So especially in this early age, we know that he was working with artists as an assistant in their studios, probably as a still life specialist above all. And there are a couple of these half-length male figures with a still life element that we think probably fit into these first couple of years in Rome. This in the Fondazione Roberto Longhi in Florence, and there are 3 or 4 copies of this, which is an indication that people liked it. It was successful. This very famous painting, which is the first time that we know of that we see him as in the guise of a figure in the painting. So this is a self-portrait as if he were the figure of Bacchus. It's called the sick Bacchus because he has this greenish, grayish complexion, and no one has really come up with a good explanation for what that might be. He had some early instances of being wounded in fights, of being sick. Whether or not that's actually how he's depicting himself or it's some other stylistic choice, the important thing is to see the kind of moving forward of this embrace of still life, which at this point in time in the history of art in Europe was not an independent genre. You didn't just paint a still life. So they're embedded in a larger composition like this. This one is a famous example of him attempting to depict a violent reaction. In this case, if you look, it's hard to see in the slide, but if you look closely, there is a lizard hiding out in the floral still life who's biting this gentleman's finger. And again, this sort of effeminate, beautiful young man is shown half-length with this still life element dominant and attempting to capture some sort of a fleeting emotion. And then the still life, right? And in this actually, this painting always feels like the still life is sort of tacked on to the depiction of the figure, another one of these beautiful young men. We'll get into that. But really, that still life can and will be lifted out separately. And this is why scholars have speculated that he may have been actually a still life specialist working in bigger studios for other artists at this time. Kind of the most accomplished of these in terms of the treatment of the anatomy and the light and the sensitivity to the still life is this painting in the Uffizi, where we see kind of where he'll end up going. So the still life is extremely beautiful and extremely realistic. When we pay attention to the details, the leaves have holes in them. The fruit is overripe. The figure of the Bacchus type figure has ruddy hands and dirty fingernails. So we're seeing an observation of things that are drawn from real life, but shown in the guise of Bacchus as a god. He's supposed to be ideal and perfect, and yet we see this kind of alternative approach to how that should be depicted. And then the idea that this is how you hold a wine glass. If you're elegant, I would be terrible at this. You hold it by the base, this beautiful Venetian glass, and you see the ripples of the wine on the surface as his hand moves a little bit, which is just the kind of observation that he becomes known for. And this early period of observation of still life really comes to a head. One of the first independent still lifes, so not part of a larger scene, but a still life of and for itself, which was painted for a powerful churchman who was also a collector named Cardinal Carlo Borromeo, and it's in the Ambrosiana, which was his personal collection in Milan, and who clearly, aside from collecting religious art, appreciated this kind of approach. And again, you see the bruised fruit and the sort of wilting leaves, the illusionism that the basket is coming out over the edge and might tip forward is also an invention of his. His figure painting in this circle in Rome is really where he makes a mark and attracts patronage and moves forward. One of the earliest, and again, we're just basing the dating of these paintings on a perceived kind of progression of style, but one of the earliest paintings that we think we know is a scene of a fortune teller. In the past, she has been called a gypsy fortune teller. We would today call her a Romani woman who's fortune telling, and this is a kind of a stereotypical scene that often would occur in a tavern or on the side of the street. And she's shown as, in a way, drawing in this young man who's dressed in garments that are expensive. He's meant to sort of signify a young nobleman, although the figure type is still the same, the beautiful young man with kind of round cheeks and curly black hair that we saw in all of those half-length Bacchus figures. Now he's sort of transformed into a contemporary Roman figure. And she's reading his palm. And in some of the early accounts of this fortune teller scene, the writers would say that she's stealing his ring. And that is based on a stereotype of what these fortune-telling women who worked on the streets of Rome were sort of stereotypically known for, which was thievery. And in this case, I've looked and looked and looked, and there's no ring there. She's absolutely not stealing his ring. So there's a real kind of layering of meaning of both in the period and also now. And so this, I have a quote from, he had an early biographer, several 17th century biographers wrote about him. This one about basically 60 years after his life, but based on earlier biographies, and so fairly well-informed. He's writing in 1672, and he says about this painting, he's talking about Caravaggio's figure type and where he draws his models from. When he was shown the most famous statues of Phidias and Glycon, these are ancient statues, in order that he might use them as models, his only answer was to point toward a crowd of people, saying that nature had given him an abundance of masters. In these two half figures, Caravaggio translated reality so purely that it came to confirm what he said. And so even though I think when we look at this today, we see it's a little kind of cleaned up, it's a little stylized, that is the takeaway from how his work was received in his lifetime and after in Rome and beyond, was that he was drawing models from the street. He was going into the tavern, and he was drawing models from the people that he hung out with, and we'll get into that kind of, he had a life. Also to point out, again, maybe he lands in Rome in 1592. Again, we're guessing at dates 1594. A little bit later, these paintings were incredibly popular immediately. And so with many of them, and just in this case, we have two paintings that are considered autographs, slightly different variants of the same composition, the paintings went through noble collections. So there's a desire for other artists and Caravaggio himself to repeat his compositions in multiple versions because there's a need for that or a want for that in the market. When you go upstairs to 211, one of the highlights of the installation among rivals is this picture from the Kimball Museum, which gained him entree into his first circle of noble patronage with a man called Francesco Maria del Monte, who was cardinal of the church. He was not as wealthy as some of the kind of princes of the church that we think of. These are hangers-on and usually family members or nephews or something that are related to the Pope at the moment. They're in political favor and they gain the wealth and power that you would assume with that. But Del Monte he wasn't unconnected, but he didn't have the wealth that some of the others did. And he was really out there trying to find and collect contemporary artists and young contemporary artists. And he's Caravaggio's first major patron. And then because he's an important figure, he was very courtly. He loved music. He loved feasting, not really the most holy life perhaps, but and collecting art, but he couldn't afford the guys who were already there on the scene. So an artist like Caravaggio was intensely desirable to him. And this is the first painting that we know of that ended up in Del Monte's collection, a scene of men who are cheating at cards. And he lays out in this picture a narrative that once you can kind of glean the details, and if you were someone who lived in 17th century Rome, you would immediately see what is happening here. And I'll read you the same biographer from 1672, writing about this painting, and he lays it out. He clearly was standing in front of it when he made the notes on this. He lays it out very clearly. He showed a simple man holding the cards, his head portrayed well from life and wearing dark clothes. And on the opposite side, there is a dishonest youth in profile who leans on the card table with one hand, while with the other behind him, he slips a false card from his belt. A third man close to the young one looks at his cards and with 3 fingers reveals them to his companion. And so the young man is a dupe. He's dressed in black and dark red velvet. This is the height of expensive clothing at the time. He is a young man from a wealthy family who is not streetwise. And these 2 gentlemen who are in very theatrical costumes and really drawn from the theater. That's not what you would wear on the street, this kind of colorful, patched together costumes in different colors and patterns are cheating him, and Caravaggio gives you everything that you need to know to read this scene. So even down to the detail of the older man behind the young dupe has the finger cut out of his glove so that he can feel marked cards. And this becomes really the jumping off point for an entire genre of tavern scenes in European, and especially in Italian art, but also in Northern European art. Working for Cardinal Del Monte, the owner of the last painting, I mentioned that he was a patron of music, and we have a series of pictures that show musicians working in this kind of, again, beautiful young men shown half-length guys, this picture at the Metropolitan, and this lute player who's shown in the act of singing. His mouth is open, but his tongue is behind his teeth. He's in the process of singing. You can actually, people have identified the music that's on the page in front of him, which is a madrigal about love. And that gets us to the religious painting that's in the exhibition upstairs, another one of these half-length approaches to composition, figures behind a table. But in this case, they're saints, although they're shown in the garb and the guise of individuals that you would recognize from 17th century Rome. And the religious subject is that this is Mary Magdalene, the woman who's holding on to the curved mirror, and her sister Martha. And Mary Magdalene in the biblical understanding is thought to have been a prostitute, again, in the biblical understanding. And Martha, her sort of more devout sister, is hearing her as she's giving up that life of sin because she's been convinced by Christ to turn into a life of sanctity and devotion. So all of the implements of vanity, her beautiful dress, but moreover, the mirror, the curved mirror, and the comb and the pot for makeup are the things of her previous life that she's giving up. He, in this early Roman period, really gloms onto a kind of approach to religious painting where he's taking figures that do seem like they are walking off the streets of Rome and casting them in the guise of a historic, quote, historic person from the Bible or from biblical history. And this is his second approach to the penitent Magdalene. And a biographer at the time said about this picture, "It seemed not a religious painting at all, a girl sitting on a low wooden stool drying her hair." And that casting of a contemporary figure, she's wearing 17th century Roman costume, into the guise of a saint is part of what made him so approachable and desirable for his audience. An outlier. He doesn't shy away from kind of violent depictions. It's usually in the sense of the history of the Catholic Church, martyrdoms and stuff like that. But decapitation is something comes up again and again. And this was a commission from his friend, we think, from his friend Cardinal Del Monte to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Ferdinando de' Medici, and it's actually on a shield. It's on a curved shield. It's the ancient tradition of the head of Medusa defeating Perseus because of her hideousness and stopping him in his tracks because of, or that's the idea, because of her hideousness. And it's a tradition to depict the head of Medusa on a shield for warriors going into battle, for soldiers going into battle. But he takes it to another level. Those are real snakes that make up her hair, and a kind of attempt at an expression envisioning what would happen if this were happening to a real person. He is active in Rome a bit as a portraitist, although I think I would say not as successfully as his religious and his genre paintings. This gentleman, Maffeo Barberini, becomes Pope Urban VIII. So again, he's attempting and successfully attempting to ally himself with really some of the most powerful church-affiliated households in Rome. This picture, unfortunately, really unfortunately, and tragically destroyed in World War II. And so we have a very bad old photograph, but I think it might not have actually been that great of a painting to begin with. But a woman that we think is called Figlia de' Melandroni, who was a courtesan in Rome. Rome is a town full of men, and so there was an active appreciation for women who worked as courtesans, and oftentimes with Caravaggio getting into fights about them, women that he was romantically affiliated with, and then the other men that they may have also been affiliated with. And in this case, we know that this woman called Figlia de' Melandroni was a model for Caravaggio. So we see her turn up in the guise of St. Catherine of Alexandria, caressing the sword that will be the end of her life, another beheading. This is like the precursor to the beheading, and here's another beheading. Maybe his most violent painting, quite well known, where the same young woman, probably Figlia de' Melandroni, is the model for Judith gaining power over the General Holofernes. And I just want to come back and point out that she's the same woman, if we think she is Figlia de' Melandroni, is the model for the Magdalene in Detroit's painting, which is upstairs. He makes a name for himself in 1600. He shoots to the top headline when he has a commission for the Contarelli Chapel in the Church of San Luigi dei Francesi. He has the commission for 2 of the side paintings, and they're still in situ. When you go to Rome, they are on the Caravaggio circuit. They are monumental. And his first outing as a history painter for multi-figure, large-scale compositions. This one is a little bit complicated to read, and when you do the look at the X-rays, he had a first go at the composition and thought didn't work, and then he went back and did this, which maybe also doesn't quite work. But the painting that does work is the Calling of St. Matthew. Matthew is here, who me, is what he's saying with that gesture. He's a Roman tax collector. He's the bad guy, and here's the figure of Jesus Christ, who's saying, yes, you. And this is really set within the kind of interior, or maybe it's in the alley outside of a Roman tavern. But this is the gentlemen around the table are wearing Roman costume, just like those theatrical costumes in the painting of the card sharp. So this dramatic telling of a story, and again within the guise of contemporary Rome, is what makes him really quite compelling. And his first iteration of or experience with being rejected, which is something that happens to him throughout his career. He had several altarpieces that were commissioned and then turned away for reasons that are mostly lost to history. Again, the painting on the left of the screen, lost, unfortunately, from the Kaiser Friedrich Museum during World War II. We only have a black and white photo. The Calling of St. Matthew. What in the world could be problematic about this, right? It's beautiful. The idea that Matthew is a father of the church, right? He's one of the four evangelists, the four writers of the Gospels, and this is showing him being inspired by the divine to write his gospel. But in this case, he's barefoot, his foot is dirty. This foot the altarpiece, the main altarpiece. It's sticking out over the main altar of the church. And the angel isn't just inspiring him, he's physically holding his hand and moving it, so that the implication, and again, speculation from art historians, the implication might be that he's unable to complete this task on his own. And then the painting on the right, which is the one that you see in the chapel today, you have the same inspiration story, but the angel is cleanly up above, and he's ticking off the didactic points of inspiration, and then Matthew writes them down. They're both extremely beautiful, but there is a really distinct difference in the interpretation. This cycle of paintings just rocked the Roman art world. No one had ever seen anything like this. He goes on in the next year and two to do another major chapel in the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo, also still in situ. The crucifixion of St. Peter on one wall, and one of the most powerful paintings I think he really ever produced, the conversion of St. Paul. St. Paul is, again, one of the bad guys, a Roman, and against the early Christian movement, so saith the text. And he's on the road, and he is knocked off his horse by a vision of God and converted. And what does that look like? Well, here's a man who's been knocked off his horse, blinded, and kind of overwhelmed. The first iteration, which was rejected, is the one on the left, which is maybe too fussy and not quite as emotionally direct. Again, there's no documented reason why these paintings didn't please the patron, but in this case, we do again have a surviving first version and second version. This kind of dramatic approach to staging religious narrative is really what marks his later Roman works, like this Sacrifice of Isaac, where he's following the will of God to sacrifice his son, and he's actually pinning his neck down. And in many of these paintings, it does not get that physical in terms of treating the subject. He's pinning his neck down. He's got the knife right there. And the angel has to come in, who stops him, who says, no, you've proven your point. Yes, you've proven your point. Has to grab his arm to stop him. It's a much more dramatic and personal approach than what is the tradition. The gesticulation, the kind of stereotypical Baroque approach to composition, where people are gesturing and interacting and on top of each other, layered together with expressions of drama. You see in smaller scale works like this for a private collection, a painting that, if you've read the book called The Lost Painting, was rather famously rediscovered in the Jesuit college in Dublin in the 1990s. The betrayal of Christ by Judith in the Garden of Gethsemane, and the gripping of the figure in the middle. And I just want to point out that the bearer of light to the scene is a self-portrait of Caravaggio. On a larger scale, this same kind of drama and gesticulation, this was for a new establishment of a church called the Chiesa Nuova, for the Oratorian order, which was a counter-Reformation new order. It's now in the Vatican museums, and again, with the really careful approach to how to build a crescendo of kind of mourning in this scene as Christ is being placed into his tomb. One more famous rejected altarpiece that many of you will have known, you go right past it on your way to the Mona Lisa in the Louvre. So slow down. For a church called Santa Maria della Scala in Rome, and it was rejected. It's a fabulous altarpiece. The death of the Virgin Mary, and miraculously all of Christ's followers, his disciples, appear at her deathbed. And it really is a portrait of grief, right? Everyone's sort of reacting in a different way. And then we have, again, Mary Magdalene. We see her here in the foreground, just doubled over with her head on her knees, reacting to the grief that she's feeling. Why would you reject that? The early commentators say that they think that the very dead-looking body of the Virgin Mary they accuse him of having used the body of a prostitute who had drowned in the Tiber River in Rome as a model. And that's certainly not what you want as the model for the Mother of God, right? That's speculative, but the idea that she looks very dead is probably actually what the criticism is here, because traditionally in the history of art, in this subject, she's meant to be shown dying, seated upright with her hands like this and like going straight up into heaven. And Caravaggio couldn't deal with that. Like, that's not what it looks like when someone passes away. And this is a much more affecting and realistic approach to that. He starts to get into trouble in terms of the law in Rome. And this is maybe why we know him somewhat the best today. He shows up, we know him very well in the history of art because of his interactions with the police in Rome. And he shows up in the criminal archives. I have several examples. In 1600, he was living with Cardinal Del Monte, his first patron. He was arrested for beating a nobleman, a guest of the cardinal, with a club, resulting in an official complaint to the police. Between May and October 1604, he was arrested several times for possession of illegal weapons. That's carrying a sword, a concealed sword, and for insulting the police. He was throwing rocks at them. He was sued by a tavern waiter because the waiter got his order of artichokes wrong. He ordered that it was boiled versus fried, and whatever he got wasn't what he ordered, and he threw the plate of artichokes at the face of the waiter. In 1605, he had to flee to Genoa for 3 weeks. He seriously injured a Roman notary in a dispute over a prostitute called Lena, who was both a lover and a model for Caravaggio. The notary reported having been attacked with a sword, causing a severe head injury. Caravaggio's patrons intervened, and he was allowed to come back to Rome from Genoa. He was then sued by his landlady for not having paid his rent. Out of spite, he threw rocks through her window at night. In November of 1605, he was hospitalized with an injury that he claimed was caused by himself falling on his own sword. Probably not. The most dramatic of them, though, is on the 29th of May in 1606, he killed a young man, a sort of lower nobleman called Ranuccio Tomasoni, who came from a fairly powerful family. He killed him, murdered him in a street fight. And the sources are back and forth on what the reason for this altercation was, over a tennis game, a fight over the attentions of a courtesan, unknown, but he murdered him, and that's a capital offense then as in now, and he's given a death sentence and had to flee Rome. So from Rome, and for the rest of his life, he dies in 1610, he's on the move. It's not that he's not known. He's a celebrity wherever he goes. He first goes to Naples for a few years, where he completes major altarpieces for, in this case, a charitable organization in Naples. The painting's still in its original location. From Naples, he gains a knighthood in the Knights of Malta. And he moves to Malta. Probably he thought a knighthood would help him out with his case back in Rome, sort of socially climbing. His largest altarpiece, something like 17 feet by 12 feet, for the major chapel of the Knights of Malta. Dramatic and beautiful depiction of the beheading of St. John the Baptist. And the only time that we know of that he signs his name on a picture, and gotta be a stereotype, in the blood of the Baptist, it says F. Michelan, and then it kind of goes off, but Fecit Michelangelo. And that would have been right over the altar in the church. From there, he goes on to Sicily, paints a series of altarpieces that are very kind of humble in their approach, shepherds and poor people in the guise of religious figures. In this case, this painting was unfortunately stolen from the church in 1969, presumably by the Sicilian mafia. At the end of his life, quite a conundrum. He seems to have thought that he could get back to Rome and gain a pardon from his death sentence. He sets off in a boat. He had gone back to Naples, got into a fight, been injured, sets off in a boat to go back to Rome, armed with a couple of paintings that end up in the collection of a powerful cardinal of the church, Scipione Borghese. Maybe they were meant as a kind of bribe. But he ends up on the beach. There's a whole story about him missing his boat. Basically, he ends up on a beach. It's the summer, and he either gets malaria or he has kind of sepsis or an infection from his injury in Naples, and he dies in 1610 on the beach in a town called Porto Ercole. But for our purposes, his legacy is long, and that's what I hope we bring across in the exhibition upstairs, together with pictures together with him of followers like Giovanni Baglione, who was one of his first biographers. Baglione writes a life of the artist in 1642. The Art Institute has this fabulous painting. Not many of his paintings can really be called fabulous, I'm sorry, but true. This picture of the Existia St. Francis that exists in two versions. Ours has the blue on the angel is ultramarine. LACMA's does not have ultramarine, so maybe ours is the more prestigious, but it's based on an iconography that Caravaggio developed, and he really criticizes Baglione for he basically accuses him of plagiarism for these early pictures, which are inspired by the kind of spiritual feeling of these religious paintings, but also in some cases a little bit of the actual figure just kind of lifted. This was a direct confrontation. A very problematic to modernize picture by Caravaggio of the victorious Cupid, in which the model is an adolescent boy who's quite nude. Cupid being the victor over all of the worldly achievements that lay in the foreground, so music, literature, et cetera, et cetera. And then Baglione's shows a divine figure of love, of Cupid, conquering earthly Cupid. And in the figure of the devil, this is the portrait of Caravaggio. Why do they hate each other? So I have to find my notes to read the quote. Baglione gets a commission to do a major altarpiece for the main church of the Jesuit order in Rome, which was a new church at that time, the Gesù. It's an altarpiece that's 8 meters high, and Caravaggio was jealous. Baglione got this commission, and Caravaggio did not. And also Baglione, in his view, is copying his style. And so he and his friends circulate a series of poems, really inappropriate poems, throughout Rome, and Caravaggio gets sued for libel. Here's a quote. I'll censor it. Jovan, you are a know-nothing. Your pictures are mere daubs. I'll warrant that you will not earn so much as a farthing from them. It's an inelegant translation. Not even enough cloth to make yourself a pair of breeches, so you'll have to go around with your ass in the air. So take your drawings and cartoons around to the grocery store, etc., and maybe wipe your bum with them. Or, and he's referring to an associate of Baglione called Tommaso Salini, called Mao, or stuff them up Mao's wife's so that Mao can't. And then he says, I'm sorry I can't join in all of this mindless praise to Baglione's altarpiece picture, but you are quite unworthy of the chain that you're wearing and a disgrace to painting. The chain is an allusion to if a nobleman thought that you had given good service to them, you might get a gold chain. It's kind of the highest estimation of what you could achieve in your profession or recognition. He did not. So there's a libel trial, and the testimony survives in transcript. And Caravaggio's convicted. He's thrown into a prison in Rome, not his first time, for 2 weeks. The French ambassador to Rome bails him out under house arrest, and it goes onward from there. And remarkably, so Baglione is probably best known to art historians today as a biographer. He publishes this biography of artists of his lifetime in 1642. And he's not that hard on Caravaggio, actually. He talks about him being a rough character, et cetera, et cetera. He does not mention the libel trial. But he does talk about, kind of his popularity as a figure in the history of art. So as a follower who was really treated badly by Caravaggio, Baglione kind of comes off looking like maybe not the best artist to our contemporary eyes, but not that bad of a guy. Another person who actually knew Caravaggio, follower who knew Caravaggio in his lifetime, is this gentleman, unclear really in the history of art who this person is, who we know of as Cecco da Caravaggio. And we think his name is actually Francesco Buonieri, but his nickname Cecco is a sort of shortening of Francesco. And it's a kind of convoluted path to connecting a man in the early biographies known as Cecco with a man that we know of in some of the documents from the period as Francesco Buonieri, and thinking that they're the same person. We know nothing about his biography, active for kind of 10 years, this circa 1610 to 20 figure is what we think he was active in. And you can see a kind of more elaborate way forward from some of these early examples of works by Caravaggio, like this lute player, and then a much more elaborate still life in a very distinctive style by Cecco, by Francesco. And the Art Institute has hands down his most important and ambitious picture, which is very, very large altarpiece, a commission for a family's private chapel in Florence, in the Church of Santa Felicita. It was the family of the Tuscan ambassador to Rome. There were 3 pictures that were commissioned, and really this is the only one that survives, and it's the only work that's documented from this artist. And it's a contract that's dated 1619, and it's how we know what the name of the artist is. When we call someone Cecco da Caravaggio, art historians call that a not name. It's when you're making up the name of an artist that you don't really know the name of. Anyway, it's one of the most important Baroque pictures, Italian Baroque pictures in the US, and we are very blessed to have it. Cecco may have actually been an artist model and studio assistant of Caravaggio, and he may have been drawn into a more intimate relationship with Caravaggio. I'll just kind of leave it at that, but later commentators indicate that there may have been from our current perspective, obviously problematic sexual relationship between this studio model who was adolescent and Caravaggio. But these 2 pictures in particular, the Victorious Cupid that you saw earlier and another picture, which are clearly the same model, have often been called Cecco as the model. So for this chapel, we have our picture, which was rejected. Never ended up in the chapel. We're following on a trend from his friend Caravaggio. Unclear why. Unfortunately, the other picture that we know of from the chapel by the northern artist Hert van Honthorst in the Uffizi was severely damaged, destroyed in the Uffizi bombing in 1993. And so what you're seeing now is what we have, almost nothing. And the third painting by a not well-known artist today called Lo Spadolino is unknown. So the full context of this has really been lost to history. But just to kind of point out some of these drawings upon Caravaggio that you see, which is a very clear sense that these are models that are posed in a studio, that are drawn off the street, that are put into costumes and poses, and that the soldiers are wearing contemporary armor, that this angel is kind of acknowledging the viewer and looking outward, that the Christ figures, he's on a cloud, but he's clearly kneeling on something, right? He's kneeling on a block in the studio, and then that's been transferred into a cloud. And then finally, a kind of more derivative, I'll say, not so closely personally linked with Caravaggio. This follower, Bartolomeo Manfredi, really one of his most quirky and interesting pictures is here in Chicago, a very large picture of Cupid chastised, which is also based on this kind of nude youth Cupid figure that comes out of Caravaggio's work. Mars is angry at Cupid for distracting Venus, basically. He becomes really well known as a conduit from these early tavern scenes and fortune tellers and music makers, gamblers, into the kind of next generation of followers where things get a little bit darker and a little less kind of idealistic. So a picture like this one in Detroit, and this one in LACMA, where you see kind of the card sharp figure being taken to a new height. So with all of these pictures in this exhibition, Caravaggio, he's known for these large and dramatic and interesting, compelling canvases of religious figures. But when you look at these earlier pictures from his Roman period of these tavern scenes, genre scenes, like what we have upstairs, this is in a way what is most compelling to his followers going forward. The taste for Caravaggism, which is what we'll call his followers, the taste for Caravaggism in Rome and then a little bit in the north of Europe as well, it really burns fast and bright. So by the middle of the 17th century, this is a style that is out of fashion, and everyone has moved along. And that whole moving along goes also together with the history of the criticism of art, so that scholars really, this whole movement dropped off of the radar of collectors, of scholars, until, unbelievably, the middle of the 20th century. There was a Hallmark show in Milan in 1951 that raised Caravaggio back into the public consciousness. And so American collections like the Kimball, like Detroit, there's also a major painting in Cleveland, those were bought in the 1970s. And when I tell you that you cannot buy a painting by Caravaggio today, I mean it. So an artist who lived for 39 years, who had a very short career in Rome and then a periaptic career trying to run from the law for the rest of his life, a total output of maybe 50 to 60 paintings, depending on who you ask, really had a major impact in the future of the history of art in Europe. I think we have a few minutes for some questions, and we have a microphone and some staff members who will bring you the microphone if you raise your hand.
Great presentation. Thank you for giving it. I'm over here.
Raise your hand. Okay, hi.
I have an observation and I have a question for you. Based on your presentation, I'm going to say that Caravaggio was an R&R person. And at one end of the continuum, he was a rogue. And the other end, he was a religious aficionado. And my question to you is, with your depth and breadth of Spanish art, what drew you to Caravaggio?
He's one of the fundamental artists of the 17th century in Italy. I mean, His slightly later contemporary, Bernini, is another, and then the kind of more classicizing painters like Poussin in the following decades. But he and his movement of naturalism, of drawing figures from life, of observing the model in the studio rather than idealizing a figure that you've drawn and kind of, in a Raphaelesque approach, kind of smoothed out the craggy edges of, instead of looking at a figure in front of you. That is really foundational for the next several centuries. And I mean, you can go quite far into even the 19th century for artists that may have kind of drawn on that tradition of working from life, of working with models that are drawn off the street, and in casting them as types that are not who they actually were in real life. They're actually models. And so for Spanish art, I think you see, to your original question, you see artists who sometimes do the same thing or who treat an average everyday figure with dignity and purpose and narrative purpose. So like in Madrid, Diego Velázquez, my forthcoming project on Francisco de Zurbarán. These are artists that I wouldn't say are directly influenced by Caravaggio. They couldn't have known him, but that's a sort of trend that crosses Europe, really, in the first half of the 17th century. Yeah, anyone else?
Hi.
Hi.
Great lecture. Thank you so much. Has there been any speculation with any ability for accuracy on his anxiety disorder or his mental illness?
Yeah, there has been. I can't cite a definitive study on that, but there is a sort of understanding that, especially his last few years in Rome, he's spiraling downwards. His kind of interactions with the police. He was living in the palace of Cardinal Del Monte. And then he goes out on his own, and he's got a really shabby apartment. We know the inventory of the possessions that he had, and it was basically nothing. He's living, despite all of these high-flying commissions, he's living slightly above the poverty line, I would say, in our contemporary assessment. And he's getting into more and more and more fights, escalating to the point where he murders Tomasoni. He was actually probably trying to castrate him, is what the records indicate in terms of the injury that his victim had. And there is a real understanding then for the rest of his life that he's in flight, and that, speaking of an anxiety disorder, that would do it, right? That there is a kind of downward spiral, and while he does have noble connections to the Colonna family from his childhood in Caravaggio and in Milan that he draws upon to help him out of sticky situations, that kind of noble patronage that he had in Rome, he was out of that circle when he goes to Naples and then to Malta and Sicily. So yeah, there's a sense of, it's hard to diagnose figures from history through a modern lens and our understanding of mental health, but there is a real understanding that there was a spiral there. Yeah.
I wouldn't have asked this, except I heard from your biography that you worked at Indianapolis Museum. There, about 10 years ago, we were there was a painting of the Sleeping Cupid, which I've always read is only at the Pitti Palace. What's the story?
So there's a painting of a Sleeping Cupid that is from his very late period, perhaps he goes back to Naples a second time, so perhaps his second Neapolitan period, or perhaps the end of his Sicilian period. It's unclear. There's a painting of a sleeping Cupid in which he's a child Cupid, and he looks like he's deceased. And that's kind of what everyone sort of says, oh, that's pretty typical for this artist and how he would approach that sort of subject, which is not to idealize it. And there's a copy of that painting in Indianapolis at the Museum of Art there. And there are several other copies. There's one in a private collection in Florence. And there's an inscription on the back of the painting that we know who made the copy, and it's not Caravaggio. So autograph and not autograph copies, and that happens a lot with him. I don't know what the current thinking autograph nature of the painting in Indianapolis is. But we know that he did make his own copies. And then I should say the Card Sharps is his most copied painting from his Roman period. There's 50 copies that are known by other artists. So that makes it a murkier question. They were very popular compositions. And again, I don't know what the current thinking there is.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you very much for the lecture. What I'm taking away is Caravaggio's naturalism versus the idealized and the religious portraiture that you were talking about. How would that been received with his contemporary time? Was it a stark transition? Was this well embraced?
Yeah, it was both. I have a quote here. I can't remember if I read it or not, but it was controversial. And in particular, younger artists were, that's a little bit of a generalization, but there was a contingent, his friends, they were often the people that were in the taverns. They all lived in the same neighborhood. It's basically at the foot of what is now the Spanish Steps in Rome. The steps weren't there in the 17th century, but that was the artist neighborhood. I think it's still a little bit of an artist, like once you get past the luxury shops, it's a little bit of an artist neighborhood. But they all ran around together and they knew each other and they really embraced this style because what he had been coming out of, which I didn't have time to address, is a really kind of cold and formally observed, idealized late mannerism. So kind of taking an artist like Raphael and taking all of the originality of that and kind of couching it in a more formalized framework in a way that you're not depicting things from nature. You're maybe working from a model and making a drawing, and that's, I didn't mention this, Caravaggio did not, as far as we know, make drawings. None survive. And often the case with his followers as well. They were working from the live model, we think, on a canvas. And I think that artists felt that this was freeing in a way, but it was also for the critics especially. And so Baglione writes his biography of Caravaggio in 1642. There was another biographer who wrote a kind of passing account in, I think, 1620. But most of these biographers, Baglione knew him personally, obviously, but then most of them didn't know him personally. And so by the end of the century, 17th century, like I said, this style had gone out of date. And so the critics that write about it, and the biographers and the critics, theorists, are very critical. And there had been a turn towards the idealism again, the idealistic approach to figure drawing after Caravaggio. So for that 20-year period or 25-year period, it was kind of the hot new style, really. It was revolutionary. No one had done anything like that before. It's like depicting a scene of the Madonna and Child and Saints, but you're wearing a ball cap and a striped polo and jeans as one of the saints. And that's really how people would have read it. They would have recognized themselves in the paintings. And I think that was both what was compelling, but also controversial. So it's kind of 50-50. Okay, thank you all very much for coming.